Sign this before dessert, Grace. Her father slid the folder across the table without looking at me. I opened it before she could. My name, nowhere. A line halfway down. Beneficiary's spouse to be excluded from any interest in Yoon Holdings, current or future. 9 days later, the company he was protecting wouldn't be his to protect anymore. And I was the reason why. My name is Malik. I'm 34. For 6 years, I sat at that table in the Yoon's house in La Cañada on the second Sunday of every month, served food, addressed in careful English, never once asked a real question about my life. Grace's mother always set my place with the good chopsticks, the ones with the mother-of-pearl inlay, a small kindness that never once extended past the table itself. I used to think that was just how in-laws were. I was wrong. It was a strategy, with an expiration date. I just didn't know I was already past it. Grace didn't sign the folder that night. She put it in her bag, said we had to go, and drove us home in a silence broken only by the blinker at every turn. I didn't ask what she was thinking. I already had a folder of my own, 3 years deep, that I hadn't told her about either. Here's what nobody in that dining room knew. For 3 years, under my mother's maiden name, I'd been running a boutique due diligence consultancy, Callaway Analytics, out of a spare bedroom that still had my old college desk in it, evaluating acquisition targets for a mid-market private equity fund called Meridian Pacific. Nights, weekends, the blue glow of 2 monitors after Grace had gone to sleep. My actual job, financial analyst at a regional bank, paid $71,000 a year and told nobody who I was becoming after hours. 8 months earlier, Meridian handed me a target. Textile import and logistics. Family run. Founded 1987. Revenue strong. Governance a mess. I wrote 61 pages. I flagged a $4.2 million loan buried in a footnote, traced to a shell company registered at an address I recognized, before I let myself admit I recognized it. The same address where Grace's brother had hosted his housewarming 3 Christmases ago, where I'd stood in the kitchen making small talk nobody wanted to have with me. I didn't know, on page 1, that the company was Yoon Holdings. By page 40, I did. I sat with that for 2 full days before I opened the laptop again. I thought about closing the engagement, telling Meridian I had a conflict, letting someone else finish it. I thought about what it would mean to hand back the one piece of my life that was entirely mine, built without anyone's permission, because it had accidentally intersected with the family that had spent 6 years making sure I understood I didn't belong at their table. In the end, it wasn't anger that made me finish it. It was the plain fact that the numbers didn't care who I was married to, and neither did I want to become someone who let them start. I finished the report anyway. Culture note: in many first-generation Korean immigrant families, chaemyeon, social face, functions as currency. A daughter's marriage isn't private. It's a public statement about the family's standing. Daniel Yoon wasn't protecting a company that night. He was protecting how it looked at church, at Chamber of Commerce dinners, in rooms where a black son-in-law was, to him, a liability nobody else could see on the balance sheet. Grace and I had married 4 years earlier at a courthouse in Pasadena, just the 2 of us and 2 witnesses pulled off the sidewalk, because her father had refused to attend a wedding that would embarrass the family in front of people who mattered. I remember standing outside afterward in a rented suit, holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations, watching Grace call her mother to tell her it was done. Her mother didn't ask how the day had gone. She asked if anyone had taken photographs that might circulate. Grace cried in the car afterward, not from sadness exactly, more the specific exhaustion of finally stopping the fight to be understood. I remember reaching over and wiping her cheek with my thumb at a red light on Colorado Boulevard and telling her we didn't need his signature on anything to make it real. I believed that completely at the time. I still do. But belief doesn't erase the small tally a person keeps without meaning to. Every holiday I wasn't invited to. Every family photo I wasn't in. Every time someone asked Grace, "Is he coming?" in a tone that made clear which answer they were hoping for. 3 days after the folder dinner, a text came from a number I didn't know. 4 words. "They're moving faster now." I stood in a bank parking lot for a full minute before I understood it wasn't a wrong number. Someone knew exactly who I was and exactly what was coming. Quick one before I keep going. Drop in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far this travels. Okay, back to it. That Sunday, my father, Reginald, sat across from me at his kitchen table in Inglewood. The same table he's had since before I was born. One leg propped on a folded napkin because he never got around to fixing the wobble, and listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he wrapped both hands around a mug he wasn't drinking from. A man who has to remind people of his worth every week isn't respected. He's tolerated. There's a difference, and you've been living inside it for 6 years. Then, he told me something that changed the shape of everything. Peter called me 3 weeks ago, asking if you had money outside your bank job, investments, property. I told him I didn't know. A pause. He wasn't asking, Malik. He was building a case. 3 weeks. Before Meridian's offer was finalized, before the folder at dinner, Peter had already started building the wall before I knew there was one going up. Culture note. When a family quietly investigates a spouse's finances while continuing to host him at holidays, it isn't caution. It's what family systems researchers call preemptive exclusion, stripping someone of leverage before the confrontation that will require it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my father's guest room, the same room I'd had as a teenager, the paint still the pale blue I'd picked out at 14, and did the math I'd been avoiding. Peter wasn't just keeping me off the trust. He was making sure that whatever happened to Yoon Holdings next, I'd have no standing, no documentation, no credibility to stand on when it did. He had no idea I already had all three. Monday morning, my manager called me in. Good news, for once. Senior analyst, effective in 2 weeks, an $18,000 raise. I said thank you and walked back to my desk holding it like it belonged to someone else's week. That same afternoon, compliance flagged something odd. An anonymous call the month before, asking HR to verify my employment history. No loan application on file that would explain it. I didn't think much of it until that night, when I finally opened the email I'd been avoiding for 18 months. One Grace had accidentally CC'd me on, meant for her father's lawyer. I'd archived it back then, telling myself I didn't want to eavesdrop on grief I wasn't invited to feel. I read every line of it now. Peter had drafted a memo over a year earlier. Contingency planning for Grace's marital exposure. One sentence stopped me cold. Given his income level and lack of visible outside assets, recommend we move to formalize exclusion before any liquidity event. He will not have the standing to contest it. They hadn't just been managing appearances at dinner. They'd built a financial strategy on the assumption that I was exactly as small as I looked from the outside. Culture note. Researchers call this weaponized underestimation, when a family constructs legal and financial protection around the belief that a person's quiet demeanor means he lacks the resources or the will to use them. At 11:52 that night, my phone buzzed again. Same unknown number. He's not protecting the company. He's protecting himself. Look at the Inchin account. I filed the name away and kept digging. 3 days later, my phone rang. Seattle area code. A voice even and unhurried. Mr. Calloway, this is Diane Okafor, managing partner at Meridian Pacific. We need to talk about the Yoon Holdings engagement. Something's changed. I sat down slowly on the edge of my father's guest bed. Changed how? Your due diligence flagged a $4.2 million related party transaction. Legal just confirmed the registered address belongs to a Peter Yoon. A pause. Are you related to a Grace Yoon, Mr. Calloway? I closed my eyes. She's my wife. Silence on the line, long enough that I could hear her exhale through it. Then, we have a conversation to have in person. Tomorrow. Are you free? I told her yes before I let myself think about what saying yes would cost. If this is hitting different, maybe you've lived some version of feeling invisible in your own family, or your partner's. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I read every one. Diane's office overlooked Elliott Bay, the water gray and moving below, a single container ship crawling toward the horizon the entire time we talked. She slid 3 documents across the table. Bank wire confirmations. Incheon Trading Limited, a shell company. $4.2 million, moved over 14 months. from Yoon Holdings' operating account into an account controlled by Peter Yoon personally. Your report is what surfaced this, she said. Forensics traced the rest. Peter's been siphoning company funds for over a year. Either your father-in-law knows and is protecting his son, or he doesn't know at all, which is arguably worse for a man running a $100 million company. She leaned forward, hands flat on the table. I have to ask you directly. If any part of your work here has been about settling something personal, tell me now. I can't take this to my investment committee if it isn't clean. I looked out at the water. Part of me, the part that had sat through 60 Sunday dinners being handed food and never a real question, wanted this to be about settling something. The report was accurate before I knew whose company it was, I said. It's still accurate now. What you do with it isn't about me. But I won't pretend I don't have a stake in the outcome anymore. Diane nodded slowly, closing the folder with a soft click. Board presentation is in 5 days. You can't consult on it publicly, given the conflict. But the report carries your name, and Meridian doesn't hide its analysts when a board asks who's behind the numbers. A pause. You'll be in that room. 5 days to decide whether to tell Grace anything at all before she found out the same way her father was about to. Before the boardroom, because I know some of you are already anticipating it, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. It genuinely means something to see how many time zones end up in one comment section by the end of the night. The board meeting was on the 14th floor, a conference room flattened gray by morning haze, the kind of room where even the water glasses looked expensive. I wore a charcoal suit and my father's watch, the one with the cracked leather band he'd never replace. At 10 o'clock, the door opened. Daniel Yoon first, then Peter, then 2 board members who'd shaken my hand at Christmas and never once asked my last name twice. Daniel's eyes found me and stopped. 3 full seconds of nothing moving. Not his hand, not his breath, not the assistant behind him still holding the door. What is he doing here? Diane answered before I could. Mr. Calloway is lead analyst on the due diligence supporting Meridian's offer. Given the personal connection, legal has documented the conflict and restricted him from consulting on terms today. He's present as the author of the work you're about to review. That's all. Peter's hand, resting on the back of a chair, gripped it hard enough that his knuckles went pale. Diane advanced the projector. My name, Calloway, under the title. The inch-on trace, page by page. A photograph of the shell company's registration, Peter's home address printed plainly under Registered Agent. Peter, Daniel said, not looking at the screen, looking at his son. What is this? Dad, I can explain the account. You've had 14 months to explain it to me, Daniel said, and something cracked in his voice that I had never once heard across 6 years of that dinner table. You let me negotiate with our bank against numbers you knew were false. A board member spoke, even and careful, the words landing like they'd been rehearsed for exactly this moment. We're recommending Peter Yoon be removed from his operating role, effective immediately, pending independent audit. Peter looked at his father, searching for something, an objection, a defense, anything at all. Daniel said nothing. He looked at me instead, for the first time in 6 years like I was a person in the room, rather than a fact he was tolerating. You wrote this, he said, not a question. I did. Before I knew it was your company. I finished it after I knew, because it was still true. Daniel was quiet a long moment, long enough that the room's air conditioning hummed audibly. I told my daughter she was marrying beneath this family's future. He looked at the screen, at his son's silence, at the report with the wrong last name on it that had turned out to be the truest thing in the building. I was wrong about which one of you was protecting it. He didn't look at me again for the rest of the meeting. The board voted to accept an amended offer, not a hostile takeover, a negotiated majority stake. Daniel staying on as chairman, an independent CEO brought in to run daily operations. Peter was removed entirely. Whether charges followed was left to attorneys, not family. Grace was waiting in the lobby. She didn't ask how it went, she could see it on my face. We didn't hear from her father for 11 days. No call, no dinner invitation, nothing. Grace checked her phone more than she let herself admit, setting it face up on the counter instead of face down. A small habit I noticed but didn't mention. On the 4th day, she texted her mother something light, about nothing, just to see if anyone would answer. Nobody did until the 6th. On the 12th day, her mother finally called, not Daniel, and said only that he wanted to see the audit results before he decided anything else, and that he'd asked, twice, whether I'd taken anything for myself out of the deal. Not out of gratitude, out of suspicion, still, even after everything the numbers had already proven. That stung more than the silence had. 6 years of being underestimated doesn't dissolve the moment the math clears your name. Some of it just goes quiet and waits for the next opportunity to resurface, dressed up as a reasonable question. I told Grace I understood it, even if it still landed like a small blade between the ribs. He built a whole identity around being the man who protects what's his, I said. Finding out he needed protecting from his own son isn't something that fixes itself in 11 days just because the paperwork is settled. 3 weeks after the boardroom, Daniel called Grace directly and asked her to bring me to Sunday dinner. He used my name, not him, not her husband. My name, out loud, on the phone, where Grace could hear it and where I could hear her hear it, standing in our kitchen, with the phone pressed hard against her ear, like she didn't quite trust the sound to be real. Culture note: reconciliation in families built around face and hierarchy rarely arrives as an apology. More often it arrives as a small, deliberate correction, a name finally spoken where it was once withheld. That correction has to be earned in stages, not delivered all at once, or it isn't trusted. At that dinner, the good chopsticks were already out at my place before I sat down. Daniel didn't apologize out loud. He pulled the chair to his right, Peter's old seat, and gestured for me to take it. Nobody at the table needed that explained. Grace's mother refilled my water without being asked, and this time it didn't feel like a small kindness stopping short of something. It felt like the start of the rest of it. I had one real decision left to make. Diane offered me a permanent role at Meridian, Director of Due Diligence, my real name on the door this time. I could have used what I now knew about the Yoon family's finances as leverage, made Daniel's remaining years running that company as difficult as he'd made my 6. I told Diane I wanted the job. I told Grace, separately, I had no interest in being the reason her father spent what was left of his life defending himself instead of rebuilding what his son had already damaged. Some wins cost more to spend than to leave alone. 6 months later, we hosted that Sunday dinner ourselves, for the first time in 6 years, in an apartment with a kitchen too small for the both of us to cook in at once, which had never once stopped us from trying anyway. Daniel sat at our table. He complimented the food twice, which from a man who once called my mother's cooking interesting, with nothing but his eyebrows, was as close to an olive branch as he knew how to build. At the door that night, he stopped, hand on the frame, not looking at me directly. I built that company so my children wouldn't have to prove themselves to anyone. A long pause, long enough I almost filled it for him before I caught myself and let it sit. He didn't finish the thought cleanly, just exhaled once, short, and said, "Took me too long to see you weren't the one who needed proving." Then he left before I could answer, like the sentence had cost him something he didn't want to watch land on my face. I stood in the doorway for a while after his car pulled away, the porch light buzzing faintly overhead, and thought about my father's kitchen table, about the folder at that first dinner, about every Sunday I sat quietly while a family decided who I was without asking me. The 6 years weren't wasted. They were just the wrong kind of quiet, waiting for the right moment to become the right kind. Grace came and stood next to me in the doorway, still holding a dish towel, and asked what he'd said. I told her, word for word. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder, the way she used to before 6 years of Sunday dinners taught her to hold herself a little apart from everyone, including me, just to survive them. "That's the most he's ever given anyone," she said quietly. "I used to think I'd have to choose between him and you. I'm glad I never had to find out I was wrong about that." We stood there until the porch light finally clicked off on its timer, and neither of us moved to turn it back on. If you've ever been the quiet one in a room that never thought to ask what you were building, I hope tonight you stop waiting for permission to say it out loud. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this reach more people who need to hear it. And before you go, tell me in the comments, Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I read every single one.